Welcome to History of the Netherlands, where we explore the events and characters that, over time, have transformed a swamp into an amazing modern marvel. Hello and welcome to a special episode of History of the Netherlands. This episode is a little bit out of the bag, something a bit different, as we were lucky enough to recently interview Andrea-Vicky Amankwaa-Birago, a German historian of Ghanaian descent. Hang on, I hear you say. Isn't this podcast about Dutch history? Well, yes, of course it is. So here is a tidy little link. Besides giving us a great insight into her life, having been born and raised in Europe as a member of the Ghanaian diaspora, Vicky's current focus of study is the life of a man called Kwasi Boachi, a prince of the Ashanti Empire who was born in 1827. The Ashanti Empire covered most of what is today Ghana, as well as parts of Togo and the Ivory Coast. When Kwasi Boachi was 10 years old, he, alongside his cousin Kwame Poku, was sent all the way from his home in West Africa to the Netherlands to be educated. This was part of a deal, an arrangement made between Kwasi's father, the Ashanti king, Otumfuo Kwaku Dua I, and another king, one you might have heard of, William I, the King of the Netherlands. The Dutch had a need of soldiers in its colonies, primarily in what is now Indonesia, where many had been lost in a recent war of independence waged by the natives against the Dutch governors of the East Indies. The idea of having West African fighters appealed to the Dutch king, so a deal was struck on his behalf that would allow the Dutch voluntary recruitment of local Akan fighters in exchange for guns. To firm these new-made ties even more, the two young princes joined the Dutch embassy back to Europe. After their studies were complete, they were both supposed to return to their homelands, bringing the knowledge and experience that they had gained. Kwasi's cousin returned. He, however, did not. Instead, Boachi completed his exams in civil engineering at Delft Royal Academy in 1847 and was assigned to become a mining engineer. However, he went to Freiburg in Germany to study and live until he was sent to the Dutch East Indies in 1850. While working in the East Indies, Boachi was heavily discriminated against by his superiors to such an extent that he actually received compensation and a monthly allowance for what he had suffered. He remained in Indonesia until his death in 1904 at the ripe old age of 77. We spoke with Vicky about Kwasi when she was at an airport en route to Ghana. As a result, you will hear a few background airport noises, and the sound quality was somewhat affected by dodgy internet. But Vicky's enthusiasm and passion for her work more than make up for that. In our interview, she talks about Kwasi's experience, especially as a black noble living in 19th century Europe. We also discuss other subjects such as the African diaspora, identity in Europe, how different nations utilize history, and the idea of coming to terms with the past. She also delved into what she personally has set out to achieve working as a historian in today's world. We hope you enjoy it.
So my name is Andrea-Vicky Amankwaa-Birago. I'm a Ghanaian. My parents are Ghanaian, but I'm born in Germany. And my profession is I'm a cultural scientist, but I enrolled in a PhD program just very recently, I would say, 3 years ago in anthropology in the University of Bayreuth. But I have a working position in museum management at the HTB Berlin, which is the University of Applied Sciences and museum management, and I'm also teaching. So that's what I do. I do research, I teach. I am also very engaged in memory work, kinds of ways, in different collectives. Yeah.
Were these fields always something that you were interested in, or were there specific things that drew you into the study of history and anthropology?
Well, that's a good question. I think yes, because I was always wondering, when I was a little girl, I realized that people have books about their histories, but I didn't find any. My mother was a former teacher in Ghana, so when she came here, she was trying to incorporate that spirit of doing research and stuff. So she used to leave me in the library when I was 4. I remember it very well. And I was all alone there in the library while she went to the market. And I was looking for things like, is there something about Ghana or where I come from? And I didn't find much. So I already started searching from a very early age on. And when I finished my studies in cultural sciences, I always thought of doing a PhD in memory culture or migration history. So yeah, that was always something on my heart. And I think right now, politically, it was the right time to start something.
Sure. And so now I'm considering the sort of climate of Europe today, and you do a lot of work in, I hope you don't mind if we refer to it as Black history.
Yeah.
So with this cultural background and growing up with, I assume, various different identities are swirling around you, how has that been relevant to your study and research into less exposed anthropological sort of situations in Europe?
Well, I think this is really a crucial question. This was very important because, especially looking at the climate, I deliberately waited for almost 15 years to do my PhD. Seriously. I mean, even my parents can prove it to you. I really had to wait for the right moment because I realized, especially sometime during the Black Lives Matter movement that started in the US in 2018, I thought about doing something on Ghanaian history in particular, because what I realized also with my parents was they were both academics from Ghana with high aspirations in the 70s when they came to Germany, and their certificates were not accepted. So they were like trying to survive, ended up in blue collar jobs and not in the jobs that they wanted to have, like teachers, because both of them are teachers. And I was always wondering, because I realized that there's a void. There's a void when it comes to migrants. And I really made it a point for me to work with the void, to see why there's a void and how it can be filled up with histories. So looking at the research that I'm doing right now, I just went to archives and to look what is there. And I realized that it's full of fragments because people do not take care about migrant histories. So coming from that background, yes, it was really important for me to engage with that because I felt like who's doing the work? There are not many. If you look at Germany, you would hardly find somebody who's doing what I do. You would rather look at people who are doing, research about Black German history or stuff like that. But that's not really my interest. I'm really looking at Ghanaians because I'm from Ghana originally. And I'm also looking at who were the first to come to Europe. And when I looked at Kwasi Boachi, but also Anton Wilhelm Amo, who also passed through Netherlands, by the way, I felt like it's a good start to start with these people because they're like the beginning of the Black archive in Europe.
Our podcast focuses on the history of the Low Countries. And as you just suggested, you've been working on a research project about an Ashanti prince named Kwasi Boachi,
Yes.
who was born in today's Ghana.
Yes.
But he has a incredibly interesting life story, which takes him through the Netherlands,
Yes.
which we would like to get into today.
Yes.
So before we do that, can you please just briefly tell us a bit about what the Ashanti Empire was, where it was located, and its relationship with Europeans at the start of the 19th century?
Yes. Well, I mean, that's a very good question. If you look at the 19th century, there were, of course, some broader diplomatic strategies between the Asante Kingdom, which is quite known, very well documented, one of the very few African kingdoms that are well documented. And they had very close ties with the Dutch. At first, they were trading. And with the story of Kwasi Boachi, I think it's so crucial to the Dutch history, but also the Asante, or we would also say Ghanaian history, because it documents how, and I think it's a bit tricky, I have to say it really straightforward, how the Asante were also involved in slave trade. And I think that is a very interesting point because many do not know how it was, and how they went about. And when we look at it, was that he had a deal between, between the King Willem the First, from Netherlands, and they needed soldiers for the war in today's Indonesia. So he recruited soldiers from the Asantis, and the Asantis already had people whom they captured because there was also slave trade within Africa and also in Europe. I mean, there are also other countries who had slave trade, and the Asantis, of course, also had slaves, and they actually were recruited, and we always say recruited, but these people who definitely were captured and were taken by the Dutch to fight the Dutch war. And in exchange for this, the king said, the Asante king, Kwaku Dua I, said he wanted his boy, the son, and his nephew to be being educated in Netherlands. And that's something that is very common about Asante Kingdom. There's so many stories of youths who have done their education in the Netherlands or even in Great Britain. So that's how Kwasi Boachi ended up in the Netherlands and did a wonderful education. He was treated like the son of the king because he stayed with that family, with his cousin. And the story is quite interesting because I realized that you will hardly find pictures of black royals in Europe so often, because just in Netherlands alone, you have at least, I think 2 or 3 portraits in different museums. And that's quite remarkable. Also in Germany, where he also stayed for a while, because his dad asked him, or his uncle at this point, asked both of the boys to have an education. And Kwasi Boachi ended up as somebody who was studying mining, because the idea was for him to become a gold miner, because he comes from a goldsmith family, or rather blacksmithing. So he ended up in Netherlands and then ended up in Germany, where he also, extended his education. And that's also how the research got to me, because there's a portrait about him in the State Art Museum Dresden. And they had this beautiful portrait of him with a dandy tie. And so they were like, wow, there's so much information in that portrait. Can you research the background information? And that actually led me through a very long journey. I did 2 years. I was 2 years a research associate for that museum. And I went to almost all museums. I think I visited 60 museums in Netherlands, in Ghana, and in Germany. And not only covered the history of the portrait, but also his biography and also the memory cultures in the different places in Germany, in Netherlands, and in Ghana. So that's just a summary.
Just to interrupt the interview for a moment, as Vicky just mentioned, there are several contemporary representations of Kwasi Boachi in art galleries around the world. Podcasting is not exactly a visual medium, so we have included links in the episode description and in the show notes on our website, which will send you to images of the various paintings which will be discussed. Perhaps the most famous is the one which Vicky referred to, thought to have been painted around 1847-48 by Karl Vogel von Vogelstein, showing Boachi in a dandy outfit. He is depicted from the chest up, wearing a high-collared white shirt and a black jacket with a striking blue cravat tied around his neck, looking very much like an elegant 19th century European gentleman. Okay, back to Vicky. Besides the portraiture and what you found in museums, are there any other main sources for the story, diaries or anything like that that you've uncovered or used?
Well, there's a book by Arthur Jackman, who's also Dutch, obviously, I think published in the early 2000s, which is a fictional diary of Kwasi Boachi. But I have to be honest, I talked to people in the palace. I was in the Mancha Palace, which is the palace of the Asante, the current Asante king, and spoke to archivists and people, and they were like, it's so far away from the truth, because it's definitely written from a white man who's looking into a black story and writes from that kind of perspective. So there are many things which are definitely a bit, nice portrayed, but there's no diary, but we have lots of letters. I found a number of beautiful letters that tells me that Kwasi Boachi was a very vocal person. He had many friends in Netherlands and among the royals, but also in circles in Germany with composers like Franz Liszt, Clara and Robert Schumann, Hans Christian Andersen, people who write poets. I mean, these are names people know in Germany. So he was really in the very high level circles. And I'm very sure, and I didn't have the time to do that, but I'm very sure that if you look at family archives by composers, we might also find letters there. I'm very convinced of that because there's so much. I mean, I remember when I started the research, I asked a friend of mine who was a historian, Bremen, if she could just check online where I could find some information. And she already found hundreds, hundred things like letters, writings, and I was just overwhelmed. And that's how I realized, wow, I'm just scratching the surface of it. Even with my research, there's more to it. So yeah, there's a lot of material, but I didn't find it yet. But it's already, there's so many letters that are so personal that you already can imagine the personality. You can imagine the person in front of you, and it's really very, very vivid how he's writing.
There was the two boys who were sent to the Netherlands to receive their education. It was Kwasi Boachi and cousin Kwame Poku.
Exactly.
So their lives went different ways. Kwame Poku returned to Africa after his education, as was agreed. But Kwasi Boachi stayed in the Netherlands and got further education.
Exactly.
And so, like, he obviously came from quite a privileged background himself. So could you tell us a bit about like how his nobility and his skin color like really impacted his life when he was in Europe, and then later on in his life when he went to the East Indies?
Yes, what we can see from the stories, even from the articles, because there are a number of articles that we still find where he's writing something about his situation, is he was really confronted with lots of discrimination. And that is somehow like the red thread throughout the entire story of Boachi. He was very much integrated into societies. He was very, I mean, even there's one portrait that you have I don't know where it was. I would have to look which city it was, but there's one museum who has a portrait where you see Kwame Poku and Kwasi Boachi attending the wedding of the king, the second, I think, or the third. So that means he was very much, and this is really something you rarely see. That's a really interesting document. So he was well integrated, but still, because of his color, and that's what he often says in some of the articles that I found, he says, he used the N-word, by the way, to show that he's on that same level like the slaves who were present by that time. And he said, because of my skin color, I cannot do the job that I'm supposed to because I'm just somebody who's being neglected by society. And I think that is really vocal and also very interesting because it draws line also to the resistance movement in the US. Because you already had people like Booker Washington, for example, who was a contemporary of Kwasi Boachi. And so there's so much, it's so interesting because I was even asking myself with all these Black Lives Matter movements and stuff, like, was there somebody who was vocal during the time of slavery? And yes, with Boachi, we have a proof. There were people who were very vocal. And he also positioned himself very clearly. He only used the N-word, of course, when he pointed up to discrimination, but he positioned himself very clearly and said, I'm an Asante, like I'm royal, I'm an African. And he also showed love towards the Dutch people, because I remember that there's a cup in the Prinsenborg Museum and in Delft, where all his friends signed, all his Dutch friends, the colleagues, so all signed on one cup. It was probably a gift for him. And so it shows that he was very well integrated and he had lots of friends, but he was still facing lots of discrimination by his employers. And even he was paid compensations when he lived in the Indies because he ended up as a planter, as somebody who had plantations. So in our thinking, we would say that it was as if his status somehow degraded from prince who was in a normal court to somebody who was planting. But if you look at it also from a different kind of way, if you look at the Asantis, there are many who were planters, and it was a prestigious thing to do planting and to cultivate things on the field. So I think it's a very, very rich story of somebody who navigated way through difficulties, but still remained happy. Because if you look at the Indonesian part, I was in the Elmina Java Museum in Elmina, which is a family museum, but also by a Dutch family. And there I made research about the Indonesians. Is it called Bella Hatip? The Dutch soldiers, and who lived in Indonesia, and he was like the community father. It's so interesting that, it's just to think about, you are part of a deal. Your dad asks you to go to the Netherlands to get an education. exchange slaves are being taken. And those slaves who end up in Indonesia will end up with you, and you will somehow reconcile the situation and become somebody who helps the community. I think this is quite incredible.
Wow.
Thinking about the whole political context.
Yeah, it would seem that living in those contradictions, caught almost between different cultures, he was able to also integrate them quite well.
Yes, very, 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 a very fascinating man.
Yeah. Our interview with Vicky will continue after this short break. I'm sure there are a lot of relevancies for that kind of contradiction and how they apply to people of Ghanaian or African descent in Europe. And we'll get to that in just shortly. But just before we move on from Boachi, the great humanitarian issue of the time was the slave trade and slavery. And in light of being caught between or existing between different societies, how would his views have developed on the slave trade coming from Ashanti? As you said, he that was a society that was also very much involved in the slave trade, and then moving to Europe and seeing it from a different perspective. How would his perspective have grown and developed and differed from his country folk and from the Europeans that he lived with?
That's a very good question. I was wondering, and that's why it's so nice that you asked this question, because I was wondering why he didn't return. Because, the thing his dad was to tell the boys, you do an education in military, Kwame, and you, Kwasi, you will do an education in mining, right? So I wondered why he didn't return. The answer lies in the portrait. And I didn't know it. It's so crazy. I was doing this research for so many months, and then I just had a look at it and saw that the dandy tie that is on the picture of Karl Vogel von Vogelstein. That's a German painter. That dandy represents anti-colonialism, anti-slavery. That means that he had a position against his own house. And that's very fascinating. That means that this dandy was a movement. I think there was the Met Gala recently. You saw some black celebrities having that dandy. And it really means to be anti-colonial. So he already positioned himself against slavery. And I think probably that's why he didn't return. Because how can you return to a house that promotes slavery? I mean, yeah. So I leave it open for people to speculate, but it's very interesting that he walked around with that dandy that was also worn by other anti-colonialists, such as Frederick Douglass, for example. And what we also know is, and that's very fascinating of his story, is that he was somebody who collected lots of books. He had one of the biggest private libraries in today's Indonesia in his time, and he had lots of political books about resistance. So, the portrait already gives us a testimony already, but also from knowing that he was very much involved in the German Revolution, for example. He was very interested in these books. We know that he already developed a position against slavery. And as for Kwame Poku, and that's also very interesting because it's so sad, he committed suicide when he returned to Ghana in 1850, is that there's a letter that I think a researcher called Larry Yarak has found, where he was writing his cousin, or in Ghanaian way we would say his brother, where he was writing Kwasi that that's very difficult for him, and that it's very difficult for the people to understand. And shortly after, he committed suicide. So I think that there was definitely a communication about their situation, because just imagine you're a royal, you enter Netherlands, you see the slaves being servants, probably also to the king, and you are treated differently. So they definitely had a critical view about their own positioning and also the positioning of other people. And even seeing the line, how he ended up in Indonesia, you can see that he was really somebody who knew who he was, and he knew how to use his voice in order to make a point and position himself against slavery. That's very, very clear. I think that is really a very strong message that I realized after looking at all documents that I found on him.
Fascinating. Finally, just before we move on to more contemporary things, in our correspondence talking about Kwasi Boachi, you wrote to us that, I'm going to quote you, that stories like his are largely absent from public discourse and education, especially in Europe.
Yes.
They're not taught in schools, not discussed in curricula, and often overlooked in academic spaces. Would you to discuss this a little bit further, drawing on your personal and professional experience?
Yes, I think it's quite a political thing here. I mean, I think Black people were never supposed to stay in Europe. I mean, Europe is built in a way that we were not supposed to be here. And so there's not this kind of urgency, I would call it, for building Black archives. I mean, you in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, you have the Black Archives, for example, which was actually instituted by people of the Black community, because they're just fragments everywhere. And I feel like this also, it has something to do with the erasure of history, which we also hear about right now, currently in the US. Mm-hmm. But it is something which is quite haunting, because it's very difficult to get the information and to that kind of lineage. You know, like just to give you a personal note, when I did the research on Boachi, I realized I came from the same clan, which is, I was blown away. And just to give you the idea of clan, is like Kwasi Boachi's relatives and my relatives might have come from the same village or the same village area. And that is something which is very interesting for Africans or people of African descent who live in Europe, to be able to trace back where they come from. And that's very difficult, very, very challenging. And I think it has something to do with that kind of political heritage that as a whole continent is carrying. But so those countries, Germany, Netherlands, Britain, France, and others, who were very much involved in slavery. So I think it's deeply rooted in our consciousness not to have a story. And when I look at, for example, you said I should also elaborate about my own history. I remember what my mother did was very funny. As I said, she was a teacher who did quite a number of experiments with me, like putting me in a library as a 4-year-old. Or what she also did we had that carnival at kindergarten, and I always had to dress as an African. And I was telling her why. And then she said, "You are an African." And she never talked about color. But then I realized later on back, I thought it was very, very smart pedagogically that she made me be aware that I'm different and that I have a culture. And then I tried on her and said, "Hey, but wait, don't have books." And that's how I realized that it is a structural thing. It's not me alone as like somebody from my family, but it is something that is already starting in kindergarten, that you do not have any story or anything that you can mirror yourself. Like a white child would easily have something about, I don't know, there's so many, cartoons and stuff, and everything is white. But if you grow up in an environment and you do not have anyone to look up to, we feel kind of empty. And I think with also with the research, what I'm trying to do and what I also try to motivate in my communities is for people to get active, to look at these fragments and see what we can do with them, because it was quite a personal journey to put all the pieces together and to also learn about my own history. I think that is quite a privilege to have the time to do that, and also to have the necessity, because as a German or European or somebody from the Netherlands, I don't think that you would do that. But with us or people like me who have the education, it is a necessity. I think it's part of the African agency, I would even say, to do the work and to share it, not only with Black people, but with all of us, because it's also European history. It's not just African or Black history, it's European history.
it seems from what you're saying that there are several different parts to it. One being sort of a re-establishment of a European identity that includes
Yes.
Africans and others, and that being a European identity, but also members of the African diaspora making movements and taking ownership and action to promote and exhibit it as you're doing. Do I have that correct?
Yes, absolutely. That's exactly what I'm doing. That's exactly my work. I wish there were more people. I mean, very honest. I mean, what I do is, for example, I call it situated ancestral research. That's what I'm doing. That means I'm really going back to the continent. I even talk to the chiefs. The chiefs are like, I would say, like the city overseers or the village overseers, because they are the genealogists. They carry the memory. They carry the oral archives. So even looking at Boachi, I went to the palace to meet the chief of staff, who is the one under the Asante king. Unfortunately, I didn't meet him personally, but I met his most important advisor. And it was very interesting to listen to his stories about Boachi and to also put things together that are left out in European contexts. Like things that are not so mentioned, which would not make much sense maybe to Europeans as a whole, but it will make sense to an African. So it was really interesting to put these kinds of different historic narratives together and to build one story. And that's why I if you saw my text that I published in English, it's a transnational history, because normally people, if you write from a Dutch perspective, it will be a Dutch history. But if you put these two together, it's transnational. So I'm trying to bridge this nationalistic thinking, because I, as somebody who's born in the diaspora, I write with third space. So for me, there's no boundary. I mix everything up, because that's how I grew up. I don't really think like I'm Europe, I'm African. I think I'm both.
Yeah.
And so I feel like it's very crucial to step back and to maybe see ways how we can bridge the national viewpoints, also in order to bring justice to the history itself, and also to make things more visible, that not be visible because of our nationalistic. I mean, we all have it. I also have it. Very nationalistic upbringing. So that's really important. Yeah, very important to me.
Just based on what you were saying, I'm going to ask you to put your German hat on a little bit. Because the German history differs a lot from, say, other colonial histories. We won't go into the reasons and context for that, but I know from experience that German education focuses a lot on Second World War and the Holocaust.
Yes.
And I'm just so curious how you experienced going through that educational process, and in particular in relation to the concept of Vergangenheitsbewältigung.
Yes.
And coming to terms with the past, and with Germany, it's relevant to the Second World War. But as a concept, I'm just so curious what you think about that approach in education, and whether it can be applied to colonial history. And in addition to that, could you also talk a little bit about the Twi language word Sankofa, which you've got the beautiful bird taking the egg off its back on your logo image?
Yes. Sure.
There's these different concepts, and you have both those hats on, and so you have a unique perspective on them.
Yes, Vergangenheitsbewältigung. It's very interesting that you mentioned that. There's a book by a colleague who wrote a book which is dealing with that topic, the history of the Jews. And that's something that is constantly discussed in schools. We always are admonished to remember. And I think everyone in Germany who goes to school would visit a concentration camp at least one time. And you would extensively have it in high school. So it's a topic that actually puts the foundation for memory in Germany. And also, I mean, if you look at media, there's always documentations about that. I think Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or dealing with the past, is definitely something which is mostly looking at the Jews and the Nazis, which is very, very important. And I feel like also during the pandemic, you saw courses coming up for people who are interested to know more about for German people, want to know more about their background, if their dad or not their dad, but maybe their grandfather how they was involved in Nazi regime. So that's also a form of Vergangenheitsbewältigung. And this is just a new term. I think it's also important to mention that people also do their personal Vergangenheitsbewältigung. When you look at the colonial topic, I think with Germany, it is very, very complex topic, because though we had the Berlin Conference in 1885, where Africa was divided like a cake under Bismarck, I think Germans do not really confront themselves critical enough with their part they played in colonialism. And so there is no Vergangenheitsbewältigung when it comes to colonialism itself. I mean, there are some attempts. I'm very close with activist groups and also institutional activist groups, such as Decolonize Berlin, for example. I work very closely with them, who actually are financed by the state in order to bring awareness to, of course, I would say mainly Berlin's colonial history, but also Germany's. And I think it's a very, very crucial moment and a very touchy topic, especially looking at, I don't know if you heard about Professor Michael Rothberg, who wrote a book about multidirectional memory, where he said that if we remember nationalism, we also have to remember colonialism, because it's linked to each other. And he's a Jew, by the way. He's an American Jew. And he really stressed the point that it's time for people to not only look at the one, but see how it's connected to the other. And right now, also with me, as I said, I'm also a memory activist, looking at things that are going on. There is a lot happening, but right now in Germany, there's so much right-wing movements who are taking over, which are actually helping to erase that kind of idea again. Because during the Black Lives Matter movement, there was quite an awareness for this critical thought of the Vergangenheitsbewältigung when it comes to colonialism, I would say. I mean, people were getting funds, there were projects, there were institutions, and now things are disappearing more and more. And I still have hope. Otherwise, I wouldn't do my job, because I think I'm also contributing with looking at history from my, I would say, diasporic perspective. But it's a very, very, very crucial thing. That's why I'm a bit careful in using my words, because I think it's also a bit frustrating, because it's so important, It's so sad to see the neglect, and also finance-wise. If you look at all these Gedenkstätten, that is like the memory places about nationalism, you will only see either the stories of the victims or of those who were doing something negatively. So it is, and it's always the Jews. It's always like a dual thing, but there were more victims than just Jews. There were people who were handicapped. There were homosexuals. There were even Black people. So it's very one-sided still, and I feel like we're just running in circles.
With that question, and you're talking about Germany, and you can feel your emotion as a German as well, and as as someone like emotionally invested in this society, in this country. Can we remove you from that a little bit and sort of ask, how would that apply to Dutch and Belgian colonial history? For example, you've written a bit about Kenneth Aidoo and himself of Ghanaian heritage.
Yes.
I just found it really interesting how hearing you speak about that in Germany, you could feel your emotional connection to the society of the place. So just wondering how you would then look at it for another country, another society.
Yes. It's very inspiring. Very inspiring. I'm already a fan of Netherlands. I was just there, by the way, last weekend for the North Sea Jazz, but that's something else. No, but yes, it's quite interesting, because you have so many people like Kenneth Aidoo, whom I also met, by the way. I interviewed him as well, because I wanted to know more about his work. And I think with you in the Netherlands, you have the advantage that you have the king who admitted the involvement in slavery. So there was an apology, which was quite important for the Black community, if I understood it right, with those people who have spoken in the Netherlands, to hear that apology and to also see action. To see action by institutions like Dutch Culture, for example. I heard that this year there's a focus on Ghana, by the way, which is very interesting. But to see artists like Kenneth also applying, and you mentioned it, and I didn't talk about it, the Sankofa. You know, what he does is dreaming about a good future. If you look at his portrait of Kwasi Boachi, I think it's very inspiring. He's drawing Kwasi Boachi in the sense of Sankofa, meaning, the meaning of Sankofa means to look back and to fetch what you have forgotten. And it's a constant circle. So compared to Vergangenheitsbewältigung, this is an unending thing. You know, it's just a circle. And what he did with the Boachi portrait is very interesting and very inspiring. He has drawn Boachi in a way of him being in Ghana again. First of all, as an old man. And that is very interesting in that kind of engineer uniform, you know, this orange vest. And the other portrait, which was very interesting, was Boachi as a young man. And here he was inspired by the portrait I was talking about by Karl Vogelstein with the dandy. He didn't use the dandy, but he used a white cloth in an African attire. And if you know the African meanings of colors, white means happiness, joy, celebration. It also means mourning, but also outcry, something very joyous. You wear white and black, when somebody has a funeral, but also when people have weddings. And so it is showing you how close death and life lies together and how we celebrate both. And I feel like this in Netherlands, for you to have spaces for people to produce things like this is very unique, because I feel like right now there's a lot of things going on, which is very empowering. Also work by Richard Kofi, the tapestry, I've seen that. There's so many great projects going on, or even Black Heritage Tours by Jennifer Tosh, that you can easily have access to it. And you feel that there's a respect also from the government, I have to say that, for Black history. And honestly, I feel very, very happy seeing that, going there and seeing that it naturally belongs to society. Of course, I think there's still Dutch people who are not interested in that, but it's there and you have access and it's all over the place. And I think it's a very empowering thing. And also I feel like right now, what I also see, though, there's of course also some political things going on in Netherlands. I feel that still you are somehow forerunners when it comes to dealing with the past, because it's not just a Black thing, it's also a white thing. People think about it. The society in general thinks about it. And I think that's why it's very beautiful.
So you sound very excited about the work which you do. So I'm just curious about, for you personally, like, what is it that you most look forward to each day when you are going to work, and what kind of work do you think remains to be done, which you are most looking forward to tackling yourself?
Well, to be honest, I don't know. I don't know if I should say it, but I don't see myself as a professor. But I see myself as somebody who writes books, maybe for children, who writes history books. Because, as I said, it all started in kindergarten and in the library for me. And I feel like it would be great to have more of these books. And I know that right now in Germany, there are quite a number of libraries specializing in Black histories. And I really look forward to finishing my dissertation. But also, on the other hand, I'm also looking forward to explore new people. Like, even while doing the research on Kwasi Boachi, I found so many people. It's incredible how many Black people haven't been described in books or who were there. Many royals. And I would love to dig out their histories from the dust or from the water, wherever they were buried, and to bring them to the forefront. And I hope also to motivate others. I really feel like it's not only a Black thing. I don't think it's only Black people who can do that, but especially in Germany, I hope that there are more people who would get into their own histories, because even if you think about Namibia, there's also with Germany, with the Namibian involvement and the colonialism there. There are some white people who even have, grandfathers who were soldiers in Namibia. So I think it's a whole society that needs to do more. And I wish that my work can motivate people or even strengthen people to do more, because as I said, I sometimes feel alone. There are not many in Germany do what I do. So it is, I wish there were more. I hope that through this work more will come.
So just on that line, if a young 15-year-old you suddenly knocked on your office door and asked for advice about getting into that field of study and for doing more, as you say, what would you tell her?
Go ahead. Well, I think, yes. I mean, the world is open. There's lots to explore. I think, maybe I should do one step back. What I think is important is to network. What I did before even re-entering university, because after I finished my cultural studies, I was really long time in diversity management and anti-racism jobs and stuff, in moderating and things like that. I think it's good to have a network in order to have people to exchange your ideas before entering that field, because it can be quite challenging, because there's a lot of resistance. There are lots of people who do not want you to do the research. There will be people who would be very hostile. And I also face that. So it's good to have a network, but it's always good to be positive and to look into the future very optimistic. Because I mean, to be honest with you, that's why I'm so happy to wake up every day to do my research. I learned so much through the people whom I'm doing research on. I learned a lot about Kwasi Boachi, about myself, and about my family. So I think this is something I would tell a young 11-year-old little Vicky, or somebody who is, in my community, to really be open for this journey and to have friends and network that is behind supporting.
Vicky, it sounds like what started for you as a little girl, sort of wanting more stories about your community, is fully fledged on a journey where you're going to provide that for a lot of people and bringing people past, onto the stage a little bit of European history. So we want to thank you so much, Vicky Amankwaa-Birago, for joining us today. We wish you a wonderful journey, and you've made us all a little bit jealous. We all want to go on holiday now.
Yes, I do understand. So sorry. I will bring some sunshine back.
Thank you for listening to this special episode of History of the Netherlands. We will be back at some time, hopefully shortly, with a new episode following our chronology. Until then, doei. Thanks for listening to History of the Netherlands. You can get detailed show notes at our website, historyofthenetherlands.com. From there, you'll be able to find other podcasts and projects that we've created. This is a production of Republic of Amsterdam Radio.